Imagine the first moment. Not the first sunrise. Not the first fire. Not the first word spoken between two people who had never had words before. Imagine the first moment a human being looked at another human being, someone they loved, someone they hunted with, someone who laughed, and watched them stop. Just stop. And then imagine being the first mind complex enough to think the thought that followed. That will happen to me. That thought, that single, quiet, catastrophic thought, may be the most important thing that ever happened to our species. Because in that moment, we stopped being animals. And we started being human. We're going on a journey. Not through textbook facts. Not through dates and dynasties. We're going somewhere stranger and deeper than that. We're going to trace the entire arc of human civilization, from the first burial in a shallow cave to the pyramids of Egypt, and ask one question that nobody really asks out loud. Did death create us? Let's start with something uncomfortable. Right now, somewhere on this planet, an elephant is standing beside the bones of another elephant. She has walked out of her way to be there. She touches the bones gently with her trunk. She stays longer than she needs to. And then she walks away. Does she know what death is? Not the way you do. A crow will sometimes act agitated near the body of another crow. A chimpanzee mother will carry her dead infant for days, sometimes weeks, unable, it seems, to accept the stillness. Dolphins have been observed swimming in circles around a member of their pod who has died. Animals feel something. But here is the difference. Here is the line, and pay attention to where it falls. None of those animals will spend the rest of their lives thinking about it. The crow will forget. The chimpanzee mother will eventually put the infant down. The dolphin will rejoin the pod. The elephant will return to her herd. But you have never once fully forgotten that you are going to die. It hovers. It waits. It sits in the background of every plan you make, every relationship you build, every night you lie awake at 3 in the morning wondering if any of it means anything. That difference is called consciousness. And it is both the greatest gift and the most terrible burden our species has ever received. So when did it start? When did the first human brain become complex enough to hold that thought, not just feel the shock of death, but understand it as a future event? We don't know exactly. We can't. There's no fossil record for a thought. But we have something almost as powerful. We have the graves. Roughly 100,000 years ago, maybe more, something changed in human behavior that archaeologists still find extraordinary. We started burying our dead deliberately, not hiding them, not abandoning them out of practicality, burying them carefully, intentionally, in ways that suggest we expected something to follow. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from a place called Skull Cave in what is now modern Israel. There, researchers found the remains of human beings buried with their arms folded, with red ochre, a deep red pigment, staining the earth around their bodies. And in one burial, a man was interred holding the jaw of a wild boar. Why? Why give something to someone who cannot hold it? That question is where our entire story begins. And then there are the Neanderthals. For a long time, we told ourselves a simple story. We were the thinking ones, and they were the brutish ones. We had art. We had burial. We had meaning. They had clubs and stone and nothing more. That story has been slowly, quietly falling apart. In Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologists in the 1960s found the remains of several Neanderthals and something else. Pollen. Dense concentrations of flower pollen surrounding the bones. The original researcher, Ralph Solecki, proposed that the Neanderthals had buried their dead with flowers. The debate about that specific finding has continued for decades. Some argue the pollen arrived naturally, brought by burrowing rodents. But the broader picture that has emerged from dozens of sites across Europe and the Middle East is harder to dismiss. Neanderthals were placing their dead in specific positions, sometimes covering them, sometimes including stone tools. Their brains were, in some cases, larger than ours. And they were doing something our closest evolutionary cousins, the chimps, the gorillas, were not. They were treating the dead as if they still mattered. Here is the idea I want you to hold as we move forward. The moment a creature begins to treat the dead differently than the merely absent, that is the moment something metaphysical enters the picture. That is the moment where meaning is born. Because you don't carefully place a body in the ground, stain it with red pigment, and put objects beside it unless some part of you believes, or at least hopes, that the story isn't over. Death didn't end something in that cave. Death started something. Let's slow down here, because I don't want you to rush past what early burial actually means. We talk about the discovery of fire as the great human turning point. We talk about language, agriculture, the wheel. These are the inventions we celebrate. But burial might be more radical than all of them. Because fire solves a practical problem. Language solves a practical problem. The wheel solves a practical problem. Burial solves a problem that doesn't exist in nature. Physically, practically, there is no reason to bury the dead. In fact, leaving a body exposed is more efficient. It returns to the ecosystem faster, it doesn't cost you labor, it doesn't require tools. Every other animal in existence does exactly this. To bury the dead is to do something irrational. And irrationality, deliberate, symbolic, costly irrationality, is one of the defining features of being human. Now think about what goes into those graves. At the Sunjir site in Russia, roughly 34,000 years old, archaeologists found 2 children buried head to head. Both were covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads. Researchers estimate it would have taken an adult roughly 45 minutes to carve each one. Between the 2 children lay a straightened mammoth tusk nearly 2.5 meters long and a carved ivory lance. The children wore decorated clothing, jewelry, and what appear to be headdresses. This was not a practical decision. Someone, a community, spent enormous time and resources preparing objects that would never be used again, for people who could no longer use them. Ask yourself that question again. Why give objects to someone who cannot use them? There is only one answer that makes sense. Because you believe they can. Somewhere else. In some continuation you can't see but can feel. The grave goods are not gifts to the dead. They are evidence that the living believed in something beyond death. And then there is the red ochre. Across tens of thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Wherever ancient humans buried their dead, they used red ochre. This red-orange iron pigment appears in some of the earliest known human burials and continues appearing so consistently that it can't be coincidence. Why red? Red is the color of blood. Blood is life. Blood moves when you're alive and stops when you're dead. The leading interpretation, and it is compelling, is that red ochre was meant to restore something, to symbolically return life to the dead, to paint the body back into existence. Think about what that means for a moment. A human being, our ancestor, someone whose DNA still flows in your veins, crouched over the body of someone they loved and rubbed red pigment into their skin. Not to preserve the body. Not for any practical reason. To do something. To refuse to accept pure ending. To perform a ritual that said, this person is not simply gone. That is not an animal behavior. That is a theological act. I want to make sure this lands the way it should, because it's easy to hear these things as interesting archaeology and miss what they're actually telling us. These graves are not just old. They are the first evidence, the physical evidence, of human beings believing in something they could not see, touch, or prove. The first church ever built was a grave. The first prayer ever spoken was the act of placing objects beside the dead. The first theology in human history was this: you are gone, but you are not over. Most people assume religion began with gods. Some great spirit in the sky. Some force of nature, the sun, the storm, the harvest, that early humans personified and worshipped out of awe or fear. And there is truth in that. Those things happened. But there's a case to be made, and it's a powerful one, that religion didn't begin with gods at all. It began with the dead. Think about what you'd be most afraid of, stripped of everything you know. Not predators. You can run from a predator. Not hunger. You can solve hunger. Not even pain. Pain ends. The thing you would fear most, in the raw state of early consciousness, is disappearance. Total, permanent, irreversible erasure. The idea that everything you are, every memory, every relationship, every experience, simply stops. Not transforms. Not continues somewhere else. Stops. That fear is not primitive. That fear is exactly what a brain with genuine self-awareness would generate. The smarter you are, the more clearly you understand what total erasure means. And the first way humans dealt with that fear was not to build a temple. It was to refuse to let go. The earliest form of religion may have been ancestor worship, and it may be the most universal thing our species has ever done. Before any god was named, before any cosmology was built, before any priest stood before any altar, human beings were talking to their dead, leaving food for them, asking them for help, believing that the people who came before were still present in some form, as spirits, as forces, as guardians. This makes profound psychological sense. If death is disappearance and disappearance is the thing you cannot accept, then the first act of religion is to deny disappearance. To say, they left the body, but they are still here. And once you believe that the dead are still here, once you have created an invisible world populated by people you knew, you have laid the foundation for everything that follows. Gods are, in many traditions, the ancestors you never personally knew. The dead who died so long ago that they became mythological. The human figures whose disappearance was so difficult to accept that they were transformed into something eternal. Every ancient civilization built its cosmology around this problem. And every single one solved it differently, but they were all solving the same problem. Let's walk through some of them. In ancient Mesopotamia, in Sumer and Babylon, in the world's first cities, the afterlife was a place called the Kur. And it was not paradise. The Kur was a dark, joyless underground realm where the dead existed as shadows of themselves. Hungry, pale, stripped of everything that made them real. Even heroes went there. Even kings. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written, is essentially one man's desperate attempt to escape this fate. Gilgamesh watches his closest friend Enkidu die, and he cannot accept it. He travels to the ends of the earth searching for immortality and ultimately fails. The Mesopotamians were not optimists about death, but even their bleak vision is significant. Because they had a vision. The dead went somewhere. They still existed, even in misery. Pure disappearance was still unthinkable. In ancient Greece, the picture evolved. The early Greek underworld, Hades, was similarly gloomy. The shades of the dead drifted through a grey, unconscious existence. Achilles tells Odysseus in the underworld that he would rather be a living slave than a dead king. But over time, moral judgment entered the Greek afterlife. The Elysian fields for the heroic and virtuous. Tartarus for the wicked. The scales were being introduced. This is a profound development, because it means death is no longer just an ending. It is a reckoning. What you did in life determines what happens after. Suddenly, death has ethical weight. Suddenly, how you live matters beyond your own lifetime. The invisible world is watching. The dead are being judged. You can draw a straight line from Greek moral judgment in the afterlife to the structure of ethical civilization itself. In the Norse tradition, death gained a different kind of meaning. If you died in battle, if you died with courage, with a weapon in your hand, you went to Valhalla, a great hall, a warrior's paradise, where you would feast and fight until the final battle at the end of the world. This is death reframed not as something to avoid, but as something to earn. The Norse response to mortality was to give it heroic purpose. Death doesn't erase you, it completes you. The manner of your dying determines the quality of your existing. And so a people who lived in harsh northern environments, who faced genuine daily danger, transformed that danger into sacred meaning. In the Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the cosmologies connected to them, a radically different solution emerged. Reincarnation. You don't disappear. You return. Again and again, in different forms, across different lifetimes, until the cycle is complete. This is perhaps the most elegant solution to the problem of disappearance, because it eliminates disappearance entirely. There is no final death. There is only transformation. And it asks something different of the living, not to build monuments, not to fight heroically, but to live well, because the quality of your return depends on the quality of your choices. Different answers. Different worlds. Different gods. Same question. Every human civilization, in every corner of the earth, across every era of recorded and unrecorded history, looked at death and asked the same thing. Is that really the end? And not one of them could answer yes. Among all the civilizations that wrestled with this question, one stood apart. Not because they were wiser, not because they had better answers, but because they refused to accept any answer that included the word ending. The ancient Egyptians didn't believe death was a door. They believed it was a battle, and they intended to win it. Let's understand what mummification actually is, not as an interesting cultural artifact, but as a philosophical statement. When you mummify a body, you are making an argument. The argument is this: the identity of a person is connected to their physical form. The soul needs an anchor, a home to return to. And if you destroy their home, if you let the body rot away, you have made the soul's return impossible. So you preserve it, painstakingly, for weeks, removing organs, treating the flesh, wrapping every finger individually, constructing a physical vessel meant to last, not for years or centuries, but for eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed that the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate domains. They were parallel, overlapping, and the body was the bridge. The Egyptian concept of the soul was not simple. They didn't believe in a single soul. They believed in multiple spiritual elements, most notably the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was your life force, the vital energy that animated you while you were alive. It needed to be sustained after death. This is why food was left in tombs, why offerings were made. The Ka could starve. The Ba was something closer to what we'd call personality, your individual character, your essence, the quality that made you you rather than anyone else. The Ba could move between worlds. It could travel. And then there was the Ark, the transformed, glorified spirit that emerged when the Ka and Ba were successfully reunited. The Ark was immortality achieved. The Ark was the goal. But to get there, you had to pass the judgment, the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, before the god Osiris and 42 divine judges, your heart was placed on one side of a scale. On the other side sat a feather, the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. If your heart was lighter than the feather, if you had lived rightly, if you had spoken truth, if you had not caused suffering, you passed. You continued. You became Ark. If your heart was heavier, if it carried the weight of cruelty or dishonesty or cowardice, it was eaten by a mit, a creature part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. And then you were gone. Not judged to punishment. Not sent somewhere else. Gone. The Egyptians had a name for that fate. They called it the second death. And it was the thing they feared above all else, not physical death, which was merely a transition, but total, permanent, irreversible erasure. Sound familiar? The Egyptians were afraid of the same thing we identified at the beginning of this journey. Not death. Disappearance. And they built an entire civilization around preventing it. The tombs. The temples. The inscriptions covering every wall. The Book of the Dead, a guidebook, literally a manual for navigating the afterlife and passing its tests. And the pyramids. I want you to reconsider what the pyramids are for a moment. We call them tombs. We call them monuments. We say they were built for the glory of pharaohs, for the display of power, for the demonstration of what organized labor and engineering could achieve. All of that is true. But at their core, at the very heart of the decision to build them, the pyramids are something else. They are a refusal. The pyramids say, you will not forget this person. Thousands of years from now, you will still know their name. Their face will still be preserved. Their story will still be inscribed on walls. Their identity will persist, not in some invisible underworld, not in some hoped-for spiritual continuation, but here, in stone, in the physical world, forever. The pyramids were not built for the afterlife. They were built against forgetting. They were, in the most literal sense possible, humanity's attempt to engineer immortality. Let me show you the map. The Mesopotamians, death is real, the underworld is joyless, but the dead persist as shadows. Identity continues, even in misery. The Greeks, death involves judgment. The good are rewarded, the wicked punished. Moral life gains cosmic significance. The Norse, death can be earned heroically. Dying well is as important as living well. Courage transforms death into legacy. The Hindus and Buddhists, death is a transition in an ongoing cycle. You are not erased, you return. The self continues across lifetimes. The Egyptians, death is a threshold. With proper preparation, proper ritual, proper living, it can be navigated, survived, and transcended. The indigenous traditions of every continent, the dead remain present. They are ancestors. They watch. They help. They are addressed directly in times of need. Here is what strikes me about this. These civilizations did not know about each other. They emerged independently, on different continents, in different climates, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods. And every single one of them built a world in which death was not the end. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern in human consciousness so deep, so universal, so consistent across all known human experience that it tells you something fundamental about what we are. We are the creatures who cannot accept disappearance. And out of that single inability, that one refusal, we built everything. This is the part of the conversation where I want you to sit with something unusual. Every major feature of human civilization may be a response to death. I know that sounds like an overstatement. Let me walk you through it. Art. The earliest art we have found, cave paintings, carved figurines, ochre designs, is found most densely near burial sites. The first images humans made were not decorations. They were rituals. They were attempts to preserve something, to make the absent visible again. Art began as a technology against disappearance. Mythology and storytelling. Every culture tells stories. The oldest stories are about death, about heroes who fight it, gods who conquer it, souls who navigate it. Stories are how humans transmit identity across time. A story outlives its teller. To tell a story is to refuse to disappear. Architecture. The The first monumental structures humans built were not palaces or markets. They were graves, dolmens, burial mounds, stone circles aligned with the movement of the sun, connected to cycles of death and return. Long before we built cities, we built monuments to the dead. Law and ethics. The moral structures of civilization, don't kill, don't steal, treat others fairly, are inseparable from the belief that your actions have consequences beyond your own death. If death ends everything, why follow rules? It is the invisible continuation, the judgment, the karma, the ancestral witness, that gives law its weight. Legacy. Every person who has ever worked to build something lasting, a family, a reputation, a company, a work of art, has been motivated at some level by the desire to outlive their own death. Legacy is the secular version of immortality. It is what you leave behind when you cannot stay. Here is the idea distilled to its simplest form. Humans build civilizations to outlive themselves. The pyramids of Egypt, the cathedrals of Europe, the constitutions of nations, the universities and libraries and hospitals, the children we raise and the books we write and the gardens we plant knowing we'll never see them mature. All of it is the same gesture. Remember me. I was here. I mattered. Death gave us that drive. Without the awareness of death, without the terror of disappearance, there is no motivation to build anything beyond the immediate. Without mortality, there is no meaning. Death didn't interrupt the human story. Death wrote it. Here is where we have to look at ourselves honestly. For most of human history, death was present. Not in a morbid or obsessive way, in a natural, integrated way. You saw people die. You prepared the body yourself. You held the rituals. You sat with the grief. You processed, through ceremony and community, the reality that the person was gone but that their story continued in you, in the family, in the telling. Death was a part of life. Literally and practically. Today, in most of the industrialized world, we have engineered death out of daily experience. People die in hospitals, mostly. The body is handled by professionals. The funeral is brief, sanitized, structured. We are discouraged, subtly and not so subtly, from extended grief. There is a timeline for mourning after which you are expected to return to normal life. We don't sit with the dead anymore. We don't prepare them. We rarely even speak their names after a certain point, for fear of making others uncomfortable. We have hidden death. And I genuinely wonder, what that has cost us. Because the ancient understanding was that death was not just a biological event. It was a threshold, a passage that required witnessing, ritual, and meaning-making. When we remove death from daily life, we also remove the thing that made meaning urgent. If you never face the ending, why think carefully about the story? If disappearance is something that happens to other people, in other rooms, handled by professionals, why sit with the deep question of what you are actually doing with your life? There is an argument, and I find it compelling, that the modern epidemic of purposelessness, of anxiety, of the feeling that nothing quite matters, is connected to this. We forgot to remember that we're going to die. And in forgetting that, we may have lost the very thing that made life feel like it meant something. So let's arrive at the conclusion our journey has been building toward. I said at the beginning that consciousness introduces the awareness of mortality, that the first human who truly understood death changed history forever. But I want to be more precise now, because I think the standard framing is slightly wrong. We say humans fear death, but I don't think death is the deepest fear. I think the deepest fear is oblivion. Death, after all, is a process. It can be witnessed. It can be ritualized. It can, in every human culture that has ever existed, be given a story, a meaning, a continuation. Oblivion is different. Oblivion is the state of never having mattered, of being completely, permanently, cosmically forgotten, of all traces of your existence dissolving not just from the world, but from any possible memory of the world. That is the thing no human culture has been able to accept. And civilization, all of it, from the first ochre-stained burial to the last skyscraper built in a city that wants to be remembered, is our collective answer to that fear. We are not building against death. We are building against forgetting. Every temple, every law, every story, every grave carefully dug in the earth of an ancient cave, they all say the same thing in the same voice across 100,000 years of human existence. We were here. We mattered. Do not forget us. That is what it means to be human. That is what separates us from every other living thing on this planet. Not our tools. Not our language. Not even our intelligence. Our refusal to disappear. We've traveled a long way together in the last 30 minutes. We stood at the edge of a cave 100,000 years ago and watched a human being do something no other creature had ever done. Treat the dead as if they still mattered. We watched civilizations grow from that single gesture. Mesopotamia, Greece, the Norse world, the traditions of the East, all of them wrestling with the same question, all of them refusing the same answer. We looked honestly at our own time and asked what we might have lost by hiding death away. And we arrived, finally, at the thought that has been quietly shaping every act of human culture since the beginning. We are not afraid of death. We are afraid of being forgotten.